The numbers are still climbing rapidly. We'll give it another minute or so. That's settling. Good afternoon. Can I be heard, Jamie, at this point? Good. I'm Mark Tig Handel. I'm chair of the Match Management Working Group for USA Rugby, which deals with law interpretation and changes amongst other things. And this evening, we're going to go over the changes that have just been announced by World Rugby that took effect on 1 July, most of which, thankfully, are not really changes at all, or not very significant, but we're going to go over all of them, and that'll be done by Jamie McGregor, who's our staff person at USA Rugby, who works with the referees, and Cisco Lopez, who's one of our international level referees. And I will be handling questions that if you type them into the Q&A box, and I'll either, if they're right timely, I'll interrupt with them, or we'll take care of them at the end. And so let me hand this off to Jamie then at this point.
Thanks, Tig. Thanks to everyone for logging in. We did a similar webinar to this last year, which was a lot more involved with a lot more detail. So hopefully this one will be relatively quick and painless. Only a couple of changes as far as the laws go. Interestingly, there was one additional thing added today when World Rugby chose, luckily this morning and not tomorrow after this was over, to announce some encouragement around tackle entry that they wish to highlight some emphasis around that. So we're going to cover that in this webinar as well. As Tig said, joining me is Cisco Lopez, fresh off the Seven Circuit and doing some of the PR7s in the last couple of rounds. So thanks for joining us, Cisco, and to help us go through a couple of these and talk through what some of the consequences might be for referees and players as we go. And with that, let's get going. So we'll start with some of the changes. As Tig said, they will start July 1 around most nations. Those nations that still have seasons in the middle of completion will be are able to start those laws when they need to. And so in the US, with our season starting August 1, that's the date we've selected for the beginning of these laws to take effect. There will be any of the sevens competitions that are leading up to the national championships can remain with the laws as they are until that tournament is completed. So what are we covering today? Well, first off, the global law trials from last year have been placed into law. So that is the goal line dropout, the 50-22, the flying wedge, the latcher, the jackal protection, all of those things we're not going to cover in this session, with the exception of a couple of modifications that World Rugby have made, in particular to the goal line dropout, as they have turned them into law. Happily, they've actually made it simpler, which is a great relief. There are two new trials that are taking place globally. The first is what is called a break foot, which is part of the scrum. There will be a requirement now for hookers in the scrum. We'll talk through that. And also a trial around water carriers and technical zone for elite matches that have 23 players in a squad. We'll talk a little bit about that, although that won't be necessarily relevant for the vast majority of people on this call. There are a couple of other minor clarifications and amendments that we will talk about. World Rugby has also updated the TMO protocol, which won't be relevant for most people in a community call, so we probably won't touch too much on that. So let's start with the break foot. So this is a new requirement that hookers must have a foot positioned to help their stability and to avoid what is called axial loading, which is on the head of the hooker. The sanction is a free kick, and that foot forward must be maintained through the crouch and bind calls. And then, as you can see here on set, the hooker must remove their foot as the teams engage, allowing the formation of the scrum and creating then the tunnel. Now, Cisco, you were part of the MLR, which I believe was utilizing this break foot as part of as a trial for this year. So I've just thrown up a little bit of an image here. You can see the feet of the respective hookers forward. How did you find the implementation of the law, and do you have any sort of advice as to how to deal with that for both referees and players?
Yeah, I thought it was actually really useful because I think it really helps keep that space and stability before engagement. So what we're looking for when we have crouch, which is ear to ear, not heads on the opposition shoulders, the hookers are now able to hold themselves back, keep themselves up, keep themselves from axial loading, giving us those really good pictures that we see before engagement. And then once we have engagement, and then having stability until engagement. One of the other really useful things I think for this, that I found particularly useful at least, was right when you give a mark at the scrum, you ask the hookers each to go to the left of their respective side. And now that they have to maintain the break foot all the way through the pre-engagement process, then you can actually tell them, you can set them up exactly where you need them to be set up, and they can't move. And it really helps to clean up that that setup and set yourself up for success at the scrums. So I think it's really good. And overall, in MLR, we had some pretty positive outcomes from being a part of this competition trial for it.
Yeah, setting up the hookers left of the mark allows each person to be put into their own space, and you avoid things like head-on-head from individual players wanting to play games and that kind of stuff. Did you ever find yourself giving a free kick for this particular item?
No, this is one of those classic where the infringement's a free kick, but really what you're doing is some management work. And then if the players are really not listening to you, then that's when you would free kick them. You wouldn't sort of have the first, even especially with a law trial, you want to give especially front rowers a little bit of time to feel comfortable, have confidence that you're putting them in a position that they feel safe and comfortable in. So work with the players on this, but if you have somebody who just doesn't want to scrummage, I mean, that's easy way to free kick them.
Excellent. So good advice there. Let's not have a rash of technical free kicks for players for something that has just literally been brought into the game. Let's have some management from the officials. And obviously there's an onus on coaches to prepare their hookers appropriately for what the expectations are going to be at scrum time. So are there any questions or anything like that, Tig, come through on the break foot? Doesn't look like so.
Quiet.
So, okay, if there are, we're happy to please put them in the Q&A, and then we can always circle back around at the end of the session to answer specific questions on topics. So with that, let's move on to the water carriers medics law. Now, this is an interesting one, designed for some specific reasons that we can go into. Some of you may have heard of a Lions test in South Africa that may have had something to do with some specific regulations that have been brought in here, but also there's actually more to play here about the role of water carriers within the game. The restrictions that are on the screen, I'm not going to go through all of the bullet points, are really targeted towards what is called elite rugby in the documentation we've got from World Rugby. And it is only when there are 23 players in a squad. So really they're looking for top matches. And I imagine this would be the case for some championship matches and also MLR and other top rugby. So Cisco, both you and I were in Houston. Part of the reason why I brought you on this webinar is I saw you struggle to get compliance on this particular new law at the test match there between the Eagles and the French Barbarians. So talk us through where you see this, why you think this has been brought in, and what are your thoughts about it?
Yeah, well, I think especially at the top level, one of the situations that it can occur a lot of the times, usually in the second half, is that players will maybe go down, say that they have a cramp, say that they need to have some attention. They'll create a stoppage that maybe might not be a natural stoppage in the game. And then all of a sudden, that's when, the whole team of water carriers comes on, and all of a sudden now we have a whole minute off of the clock when we could have just been having that one player getting treated for whatever is wrong with them, and they can have water now with the new law. And so instead of having the game continue to move and have its just own flow to it, it was becoming a situation, or it has kind of become a little bit of a situation where there's these artificial stoppages that are slowing the game down. And again, that's why this is something that's going to be looked at as being implemented in, again, elite level rugby and competition, like high level in the sense of like championship rugby, stuff like this. Again, we don't think that this is going to be something that will be implemented at all at the grassroots level, because this is really only going to be for that elite level, where that's particularly a kind of gamesmanship thing that we see a lot of the time. And so, yeah.
I think there have been, from my own experience, there are cases where you're managing a sideline and water runners are just absolutely desperate to run onto the field and interrupt at every single moment of the match. If they can, they want to go on. And so presumably this is trying to rein that freedom just back a little bit without risking any of the health and safety of individuals. So just maybe the last point here is to look at how can players actually access water as the game goes on outside of the mandatory stoppages that are now being put into those matches. Do you want to go through the at a try, for example, where those players
perfect.
can access water from?
Yeah. So when a team has been scored on, now there's going to be a couple of either chili boxes or something of water behind the dead ball line. So the team that's just been scored on can access water behind the dead ball line that they're defending. The team which has scored will have to go to their technical zone to go to essentially their water carriers and get water in those situations. Because the only time that the water and those water carriers can leave the technical zone is in those 2.5 times that the referee has allowed them to come on at a natural stoppage and a neutral place in the game. So there are those situations, and a player can also at any point in the game leave the field, go to their technical zone and get water whenever they want of their own accord. But they would have to choose a time wisely to go to their technical zone, get water from their water carrier. Okay.
So I think that's all we'll deal with this. It's a global law trial. From our experience, there's probably still a few bits and pieces that need to be ironed out before it gets fully implemented. We'll see how these go in the remaining test matches. Some things have been smooth, some things haven't. It'll be interesting to see whether World Rugby decides to expand its use into lower levels of the game or keeps it at the elite level. But I think that's all we really need to talk about this particular trial for now. Tig, is there anything that we need to address?
We've got a couple of breakfoot questions. The first one, is there any requirement that it's either the right foot or the left foot that's serving as a breakfoot by the hooker?
As far as I know, no. Because I mean, most hookers use their right foot forward.
Correct, but you are allowed to strike with either, and
with either foot,
doesn't specify. Exactly. The second question related to the breakfoot is, we did say there's an onus on coaches to train their players at the community level. How do you suggest referees deal with the fact that the players show up and at the first scrum you realize nobody ever mentioned that in practice?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great one where you use your managerial kind of role as a referee, and you tell them, no, well, as long as I'm seeing stability, then that's going to be the bottom line. If there are issues in stability that have to do with overleaning, which is precisely what the breakfoot is there to get rid of, then you would start asking them, like, well, you need to show me that you're making an effort to hold your own weight, that you're not putting your own weight on the opposition scrum. But I mean, hopefully, and that's also a part of like why we're doing these presentations as well, is like this message ought to go to the coaches and then on to their players as well.
Could I suggest, I do not, in a role as a referee educator, I do not normally encourage additional information to be delivered pre-match. I'm actually a big believer that a lot of people want to saddle up a pre-match discussion with coaches and captains and front rows of a whole bunch of stuff that is actually a complete waste of time. And I don't actually think that it serves much purpose. this might be an exception, which might be to say for the first few matches as this new season, when you as a referee maybe talk to the front rows of a team that you're about to referee, it would be really helpful if you can raise this and say, has this been discussed? You know, have you been coached about this? And really try to just iron that particular piece out before you end up, you know, getting to the first scrum and discovering no one knows what we're talking about. That would be my encouragement on this particular issue as well. Anything else, Tig?
We had a question about how to deal with players who suddenly find themselves in a championship level match that has technical zones and all these requirements, having not faced it during their whole season until suddenly they come upon this surprise at playoffs.
Yes, I think that is. I think that's going to be true at any part of any level of the game, and so where you will have people who are used to a different standard until they reach a particular level, and then there's an expectation. And again, to Cisco's point about the breakfoot, this is why we're doing these presentations and why we're getting the message out as much as we possibly can to people, so that they at least know what is going to be expected of them once they reach a certain level of
it took me a moment to figure out what this question meant, but I think this applies to water carriers or medics, either one who interferes with a ball that's gone into touch to prevent a quick throw. Is the new law allowing a penalty on such persons applying to their interference with a ball that isn't, quote, live, that's gone into touch? Could you, in fact, give a PK if they interfere and prevent a quick throw?
Yeah, so if you have a look on screen at the very bottom bullet point, that is a new part of this global law trial. So adding a sanction for physically interfering with live ball or play, a penalty kick at point of restart. So that is going to be that is something that is a new part of this particular trial.
So I think the law isn't inordinately clear, but I think with the answer we're giving you right now is if a water carrier or medic intentionally interferes with a ball to prevent a quick throw, it will be a penalty kick 15 meters in, unless you hear otherwise from us.
Yeah, I mean, that ball is live in a sense. There is nothing for quick throws that's still live for that part of the game to continue, even if the ball was dead in touch, right? So, yeah. Okay. Are we good?
And then there was one last one of, please clarify the parenthetical at least 15 minutes with regard to the water breaks. Robin, that just means that when we, in those elite level competitions where the referee is only going to allow for 2 instances in which the water carriers can enter the field, the earliest that can occur is 15 minutes into each half. So the referee wouldn't allow water carriers on 5 minutes into the match, 8 minutes. They would have to, the first instance would be at the 15th minute in the match. And then the same thing in the second half. The first would be 55 minutes.
Righto. Let's move on. So there's a bunch of minor things we're just going to touch on briefly, but there are not really major law changes. It's more that World Rugby have either provided clarifications or they've included into law things that were previously rulings or clarifications or guidelines, have now incorporated those into the actual law of the into the actual wording of the law. First off, movement at a conversion. The ruling had previously been that if a player moves in any direction as part of their approach to kick. So sometimes you would have seen some arguments about a player as they attempt their conversion kick, stepping backwards before they actually move forwards. That is considered as a prompt for the team to charge at that point in a conversion, and that is now clearly and explicitly put into law. Similarly, players jumping into or over a tackler has previously been considered to be foul play, and that is now explicitly added into the law. There was a law query that was answered last year about diving on a ball when it was near a ruck, near being defined in law as 1 meter, within 1 meter. And that wording is now being incorporated into law, so that ruling is now more formalized. So yes, if the ball is near a ruck, you can't just dive on it as a way of securing the ball as it spills out from somewhere. Beyond a meter from the ruck, that is fine. And the last one of these four is at maul. This has long been the law. Change, I think, was about 2016, but it had, for whatever reason, it had failed to actually find its way into the law book. It was a kind of ruling that you couldn't do a long arm transfer of the ball as a jumper back to a player at the back of the maul. The ball had to be ripped from the possession of the individual and then taken back. And an individual with possession of the ball in the maul couldn't slide back through the maul. The ball has to be transferred individual to individual. So neither of those are a change, but they're now clearly placed into law. Cisco, any point you want to make about any of those four? Or, I mean, the maul at the moment is the hardest part of the game to referee, right? So
yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Hardest part to referee as well as hardest to defend. And so I think this is one that's really important because it's going to give a little bit more contest, to what the maul should be, sort of like a contest, the same as a ruck, right? Because the line out to maul is such a potent attacking weapon. We need to give defenders the opportunity to contest for the ball, or even have moments where they can push back on the maul. If the player with the ball is just allowed, or if the ripper is just allowed to slide behind 6 of his teammates, well, then there's no way, while those teammates are all pushing forward, then they're able to get all this momentum plus all the structure, which is just an easy score. Meanwhile, the defense is scrambling to figure out where to even start pushing back from. So I think the maul one's really important. And I think getting the difficult thing will be getting consistency, but again, these calls and all the communication with your LROs, referees, etc., is going to be really important for this.
Have we got any questions about those four before we just talk about the goal line dropout?
If I'm trying to catch up and answer some of these as they've gone along. So the question is, you cannot dive on an open ball unless it's a meter away from the ruck. And the answer to that is yes, it's got to be at least a meter away if there had been a ruck. We did have the question about a non-player touching the ball. So this is the first time that the law has allowed non-players to be penalized. At the moment, they've only specified it as regards to medics intentionally interfering and water carriers intentionally interfering, not any other team personnel. That's the way it's written at the moment. And let's see. Someone did ask Cisco about whether or not there have been additional problems with scrums becoming unstable as the hookers pull back their break foot and having trouble adjusting to that.
Yeah, I think maybe that was one early on when that was being trialed in that competition. For example, I've found that through between the games of MLR that I've been involved in, that the break foot has added a lot of stability because basically their feet stay where they are, and then on set they're able to then put their foot back to then be in a pushing position. So on bind and then set, then they can move and then be in a position to push. If that was a situation where maybe the hooker wasn't accustomed to having to put their foot back so late in the scrum cadence, then they might have not timed it correctly and actually gotten hit while they should have been putting their foot back. And those are the teething issues for sure for the technique side of things. But I think overall it will be actually better for stability than worse for stability.
Yeah. In fact, I'll add, prior to all the cadences, hookers used to put a foot out in front to keep their second rows from driving them into the opposition early anyhow. It's what we just used to do. We did have a question, can a ref add additional water breaks if warranted by conditions?
Not exactly. There is in law already a 20-minute water break that exists for hot conditions, and that is added to the 2 water breaks that are already there. So in hot conditions, you can have 3 water breaks per half is the way that works. If conditions aren't conducive to requiring a not hot weather and we don't need the water break, then you would stick with the 2 per half.
Okay, when a penalty kick or free kick is awarded and time is stopped due to an injury and the injury is being addressed, does the referee need to allow all the players that have come off the field into the tech zone to get water to come back onto the field before play is restarted?
I would highly recommend that you wait for all of the players to be on the field before you restart the match. That would be that is an excellent suggestion. I agree. And so this is part of the teething issues that I think World Rugby not necessarily expecting some of the consequences of what they've designed. We've seen a couple of unintended consequences already in the 2 test matches that we've had here in the States. So I suspect there'll be some subtle changes before this is fully implemented in the future. All right, let's move on to the goal line dropout. This is actually a significant change, because the law, when it was originally written, created some weird scenarios in terms of whether the ball was put into the in goal by the attack or the defense, determining whether or not we ended up with a 5-meter scrum or a 22 or a goal line dropout. And the law has been rewritten now so that it's very clear that if an attacking player puts the ball into the in goal and it's then held up, grounded, or otherwise made legally dead, then we have a goal line dropout.
No. Made dead by the defense.
Made dead by the defense. Sorry, yeah, that's a good point. If it's
Not
made
just
dead by the
made
attack,
dead.
it's a different story, right?
Right.
So
If the attack takes the ball, well, finish this and go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's all good. So you can see here the 2 scenarios that were previously different that have now been added into what results in being a goal line dropout, and they are both where the attack has carried the ball, or in the case of a charge down, where the attack has charged the ball down. So this kind of was like a missing part of the law, because it never really covered what happened when the attack put the ball into the in goal and then the defenders made the ball dead. We do end up with one weird scenario here, which is the fact that you've got a goal line dropout when the defense puts the ball into the in goal area and it is knocked on in goal by the attack. That will still result in a goal line dropout, which people might say, when is that ever going to happen? And it happened last week or 2 weeks ago in the Scotland A Chile match. There was I think that might have been it. There was a case where a line out close to the line was knocked. The ball was knocked backwards by the defense into their own in goal. An attacking player got there first and knocked it on before they could score. And that would be a goal line dropout in this particular case. Are there any specific scenarios we want to highlight here as being a change? I think the other one is the one in the bottom right corner here, where defenders put the ball into the in goal and it's held up. That will result in a 5-meter scrum to the attack.
And even though the attack is putting it in, a knock on into in goal from the field of play is still a scrum to the defense at least 5 meters from the goal line.
Yeah, so there's a difference there between...
Even though the attack has put the ball into goal, if the defense makes it dead after that, that still comes out to being a scrum. It's not played as an in-goal situation.
Yeah. Okay. I don't think we've got anything else we want to cover about that in goal line dropout there. Is there a question there about that?
No, the only other question has to do with the 1 meter stuff. We'll come back to that at the end.
Sweet. Okay, so this has cleaned up some bits and pieces that were not previously clear in law. So that should make things a little bit more consistent for referees as we move on. Very minor amendments, uncontested scrums. This was just something that wasn't explicit in law. We now wait until the next scrum before we work out what the consequences are for uncontested scrum. Previously, it suggested that it would be at the stoppage where a player leaves the field that causes uncontested scrums, whereas now we have to wait until the next scrum actually occurs. So what this means is that if a team otherwise would lose a player, but we go, say, for example, due to a yellow card, but we go 10 minutes with no scrums, well, then there are no consequences for them. But if we have a scrum in that period, then we look at what the consequences are for that particular team. And all the details about uncontested scrums are covered in the game management guidelines. If you want to have a look at that and knock yourself out. And if you're the number 4-5 for the New Zealand Ireland match. You're also welcome to check that out in the game management guidelines and see how you go. So let me tell you, it is not simple. It is not easy. Uncontested scrums are very confusing, and I wish they would change, but it is what it is. Rolling replacements for sevens. Unions can now decide if they want to use rolling replacements in sevens tournaments. So that's just a change in law. It's allowed, rolling replacements is allowed for 15s, but it wasn't for sevens. So they just tidied that up by allowing that in both particular cases. Plus,
everybody was just ignoring the fact that they'd messed up the way they wrote it before.
Yeah. And there's also permitted clothing in here for headscarves and player monitoring devices and restrictions on padded leggings, a couple of minor bits and pieces. The full description of what is allowed and what isn't, we will show you. I'm just going to put here, there is a resources page on the USA Rugby website that has a listing of all of the law changes and a summary of those. So you can check out those in more details if you want to have a look at the details for that. And I think this is the last one we want to discuss, which is, again, some more minor amendments. Players on the ground in the in goal. Previously, under law, they were allowed to ground the ball to score a try. That went away when the law was written into plain English, and they have just returned that to what it was previously. Similarly, the ball being knocked from an opponent's hand in goal backwards from the point of view of the defender, that is legal. So when someone is reaching out to score a try, you can knock the ball from their hands so long as you do not kick it. You can knock it or attempt to rip it out as needed. And the last one here is they've made clear that the ball being prevented from being thrown 5 meters at a line out from either team. If either team stopped the ball from going 5 meters, that is a free kick, which is what it always was. But when the law was written into plain English, it kind of got forgotten. For a while there was a picture of the incident, but there was no law that actually identified what the sanction was or what the problem was. So they have now updated that and aligned it with the quick throw as well. Any points to be made there about those couple of things before we move on?
I've got some questions here that aren't related to that, but they're all pretty direct. I'll answer them. We were asked, are there specific monitors that are permitted to be worn by players? There's actually on World Rugby's site some more specific information about recording devices. You'll sometimes see they're very small and they're usually in the middle of the back between the shoulders, and their pockets for them. You're most likely not going to see teams with them. They are a very expensive bit of technology to outfit a team with, and it'll only be seen at the highest levels. Are referees meant to interpret either cautioning or sending off medics or water carriers? Would they be shown a yellow or red card? In the US, yellow and red cards are not to be shown to non-players. However, you can order off any team personnel away from the playing area. Totally gone. If you need to, you just don't use a yellow or red card on it. The other question we have is related to 1 meter. If the ball goes to the ground in a maul, does it apply there? So I'll note two things here. In a maul situation, if the ball ends up going to ground with still players on their feet, the maul has been changed into a ruck, and ruck law applies. Mauls can become rucks, they cannot become tackles. And there are 3 situations where you cannot dive on a loose ball as it emerges, and that's coming out of a tackle, out of a scrum, or out of a ruck. And they all basically have that 1 meter requirement that the ball is away from the tackle, the ruck, or the scrum before anybody can go to ground to play it.
I think the way to think about this is it's in part a safety mechanism, because we don't want a pile up around where there are existing bodies on the ground. So that's part of the logic and the rationale behind this. I want to clarify one point to Tiggs. A maul can become a ruck. That is if the ball is dropped. If the ball carrier in a maul goes to ground, we have a different set of paths to follow. But if the ball is dropped onto the ground, then yes, it becomes a ruck with players staying on their feet, which is an unusual occurrence, but it does happen sometimes. So good one to note. Any more questions before we head on?
That clears the bin.
Sweet. So as we said, these are the resources. Check them out on the website if you want. There is a PDF that lists all of the summary, the laws in a more easy to read fashion, and also in a fashion that has the clear wording that is actually in the law. Plus, we've also got a copy of these slides that have been slightly modified, as well as more, the in-goal permutations document, which is the one I put on the screen, that has a listing of all the possibilities of who put the ball in where and what happened. Luckily, we were able to take a whole column out this time around because of the simplifications. So yes, you can check that out. And there's also an in-goal wallet card, which TIG is responsible for designing up, which has a very similar kind of simplified way that you can carry about if you are so inclined to keep track of what you should be doing and what you shouldn't.
And I will note that all of the World Rugby resources, the website version that is all live links, their PDF for downloading the whole law book, and if you have the most recent version of the app, those have all been updated to the laws that went into effect July 1.
Awesome. All right. We're just going to finish off. We've got about a little bit more than 5 minutes in what we planned for a 45-minute session here. We're just going to have a look at some of the stuff around this, which has come out literally today, this morning, a law application guideline for side entry at the tackle. So where did this come from? Well, there was a guideline released in March of 2020 that specifically was dealing with the breakdown. Talked about the tackler, the tackle player, the jackler, the person that arrives attempting to play for the ball, and also other arriving players. The feeling subsequent to that has been that in terms of the game generally, there has been progress on the first three of those, but there is more work to be done on side entry, in both from a safety perspective about what bits of the jackler are being targeted, and also from the competitive and the balance between contest and continuity that we have in the game. So this is the existing law. I'm not going to go through it, but they have World Rugby have very politely summarized all of the major bits and pieces that actually deal with the tackle entry. What I'm going to skip straight to are a couple of key points, which I'm just going to put up here. Cisco, do you want to take us through what it is that World Rugby is now kind of putting in front of us to say, there are no changes, right? It's just more emphasis and encouragement of how we want things to be done.
Yeah, so now there's going to be a lot more focus on players squaring up before they enter from the direction of their own goal line towards the tackle. So you guys can see in where it says square up with the orange arrows. As long as players come in, as long as they square up from there, enter from the direction of their goal line, they can then push at an angle. So we're not getting rid of, we're not saying everybody has to only push, like if they were on a train track that runs parallel to the touch line. We're saying you have to enter from that direction, and then from there you can contest. And this is, and like one of the bullet points that was in the last slide, this is to promote legal and fair contest and continuity. Because in those situations where players don't square up and they just hit the ruck from the side, it just takes out a good legal contest, right? Even if it's legally slowing the ball down, it takes that away completely. And we'll even show some clips as well that, it can sometimes get into a foul play situation. That's not what this law is specifically about. It kind of does a catch-all of getting, first of all, the good contest. And then when you have players hitting each other square, then oftentimes you don't have limbs getting levered or all these other things as well.
So I think there's a couple of different points we want to make here. So one, we're not encouraging referees to find penalties where none fit the flow of the game. So if you've got an attacking arriving player or defending arriving player who squares themselves, but perhaps may have entered mildly incorrectly, but there's literally no defensive players there and they square themselves up, we're not looking to blow penalties against players for things that don't meet the standard for material effect in the game. Would you agree with that?
100%.
What we are looking for are clear areas where players are affecting the jackler, so they're denying that player's ability to contest by taking a shortcut that they're not entitled to. Is that fair?
Absolutely.
So I think there's 3 points here that World Rugby have asked us to make. One, the backside of the player should not be facing the touchline on entry, and instead they should arrive from depth. So we're looking at being one of these blue arrows here, not somebody that's coming in to the side of the breakdown with their backside facing a touchline upon entry. To Cisco's previous point, if they arrive, square up, then we're allowing some degree of angle to contest into this breakdown. Cisco, I sometimes find referees occasionally will penalize side entry because of the effect without actually looking at the entry of the player. Like a player will get bundled out the side and you'll find a referee blows a penalty for side entry without really paying attention to maybe the player's entry was legal, and then because of the dynamics of the tackle, then that spills outside. Would you agree with that, or have you found yourself in a similar situation with something on review?
I found myself in many a situation like that.
I think so. The encouragement here for referees is try and pay attention to the entry point, not the effect of that at the end of the breakdown. I think that's where we want to go here. Can you talk us through this bit about drive, not dive? What is being suggested there?
So I think the biggest thing there is that players shouldn't dive on either the tackler or the ball carrier. So they should, again, because it's a contest, they should be looking to drive a player away from the ball, not dive on top of a player who might be a quote unquote threat, whether it's to the contest of the ball or continuity of play. They should be looking to move the player rather than just hit the player, correct? Because that turns into a dangerous sort of like foul play situation. And I think this is something, again, right? This hasn't changed any of the interpretation that has been existing previously, where if a player has, and this is maybe thinking more about height, if a player has a really low height when they enter the breakdown, but they move a player and produce the ball at the back, then that's play on. But if a player has a poor body angle and prevents a contest, well, then that's a different issue.
Okay, so that's covering these points here. Arriving players can legally drive away tacklers, but we don't want them to dive upon the tackler or ball carrier. And keeping in mind, those arriving players can't tackle players who are not near the ball, or once they do contest someone who is near the ball, they can't drive those players too far away. Once they are no longer near the breakdown, they've got to let go of those players. Otherwise, it's considered obstruction. So they're the key.
A couple of questions.
They're the key points. Yeah, let's do some questions before we move on.
All right. So the situation is a ruck right near the goal line. So the ball is still in the field of play, but the defenders have been sort of pushed back, a lot of them into their own goal. Do players need to square up within their own goal when hitting the ruck? Especially since here the offside line, I'll note, is just behind the ball, but definitely in front of the last man. So we have a ruck being pushed into goal, but the ball's still in the field of play.
I'm worrying about a whole range of things, none of which are tackle entry at this particular point. I'll tell you. I don't know what you think, Cisco, but
I think the biggest one here is that, again, we were actually having this conversation at PR7s in DC last weekend. There's a difference between a ruck and a tackle with a gate, right? Like a tackle, which has the gate entry, like that's a different situation in law from a ruck. So, right, like a ruck can't exist in goal. So the arrival that we're looking at is also these first arriving players who are dictating how the contest is going to be shaped. So that, like Jamie was saying, once you get to that picture, I think that you're describing, it's a couple steps beyond what this is sort of speaking about. But usually if you tend to watching those arriving players, then you'll get a better picture at that really high contest, really high pressure breakdown situation as well.
Yeah, to Cisco's point, you've got to bind onto somebody, right? When you join a ruck, once we've got a ruck, we now need to bind onto somebody, whereas that's not the case entering and joining a tackle, in the sense that you can enter a tackle legally without binding onto someone. You could be the first arriving player there, for example. So if you've got a ruck close to the goal line, what you're implying is that this stuff here about tackle entry has already happened.
This is a question that we talked about before the start. So an attacking support player, if they at some point have squared up, they can then hit the breakdown at an angle. That's not quite, I think, what we're talking about. I think since we talked about this earlier, if a player has come in square, they don't have to be actually coming in right at their opponent. So if they've entered into the zone squarely and their opponent is slightly off to their side, they're then free to turn into that opponent to drive them off at that point.
Yes, this is the World Rugby. You've got this World Rugby, World Rugby diagram. I mean, it's a bit confusing, but if you go in as the orange, you're then liable to act as the green arrows. So you've got that kind of additional leverage point of entry. Mm-hmm. We're not going to penalize you for, referees should not be penalizing you for incorrect entry if you've arrived at the breakdown, squared up, and then used an angle to leverage your opponent off the ball.
And the last question that's in here is, again, another ruck at goal, is if the ball comes out the back of that ruck and it's still within a meter of the bodies and it's in goal, can you just dive on it to score a try or ground it? And I'll answer that simply. The answer is yes.
Awesome.
That 1 meter does not apply in goal at that point.
So last point on this around entry is to be thinking about foul play, all of which still applies. So as those players at the breakdown are contesting, keeping in mind lifting legs above the horizontal, shoulder charges, neck rolls, any tipping leading to head contact with the ground from their opponent, those things all are illegal in the game, and they should be severely dealt with by the officials. So we've got a couple of examples here on video that I think we'll use to finish the session. I'm just going to bring up an example here from World Rugby. So we'll play a couple of these clips. I'm not sure we'll get through all of them, but we'll play a few of these examples of poor technique, and then we'll play a couple of good to finish us up. So let's go with the first clip. So Cisco, do you want to talk us through this one? We've actually got two bits of naughty behavior here from the player in question.
From the French prop.
Yes, what do we got going on?
Yeah. So here you see the French prop kind of overruns a little bit. And this is the situation that you'll oftentimes see players having this poor attempt at entering the tackle area, as if they're the designated support player, but they catch themselves out of position. And so he's like, well, I have to hit this ruck. This is the only angle that I've got. So he hits this super legal jackal, right? First player to the ball. He hits him on his side, but then he also additionally turns him over right on top of his head. So two no-nos. The second one certainly significantly worse than the first. The first is just an error in technique. The second is putting another player in danger. Ooh. And same picture again here.
Yeah, turnover's good.
Strong on the chop.
So same thing here, right? Super, and it's another situation, you get super dominant tackle. So now all the attacking players are in front of the ball. So 15 red here, it actually comes in from the direction of the other team's goal line. So it kind of helps the counter ruck here. But he doesn't come in the direction of his own goal line. So his entrance is illegal. And then similar to the last clip, what he chooses to do afterwards as well, he lifts the player beyond the horizontal, right? So now this is again dangerous play.
Yeah, turnover's good.
Strong on the charge. Shokahoye and penalty against Ireland.
So we've got 3 players to look at in this example. None of whom take that direction of that kind of L shape and then square up and hit the breakdown. They're simply straight into the side of the contest.
And you can see two green socks just straight up in the air as well.
That isn't such a great picture either, is it? Right, I think that'll do on these ones. Let's look, because I think it's important with some of these, as World Rugby provided us, to provide some positive images as well, some positive pictures worth for looking at. So let's have a look at a couple of these.
Advantage, 13 white offside.
Onside 13.
Advantage, 13 white offside.
So we're looking here at 13 blue. Is that right, Cisco here?
Yep, 13 blue. And he does a good job, right? He kind of overruns the line a little bit, but he knows, oh, I've got to stop running, take this kind of step sideways and backwards, square up. Great job here. And this is a great example too of drive, not dive. So he actually drives the player off alongside with the teammate too, actually drives the player off the ball rather than just diving either on his player or diving on that player who's trying to contest.
A great point here is that see how that 13 blue actually goes to ground themselves. And we just want to make clear that is not penalizable. That player has attacked, hit a threat, won that breakdown. And the fact that they then go off their feet, you know, I can imagine someone on the sideline saying, look, that player's off their feet. And they've only gone off their feet because of the actions of a really positive clean out. So we should be playing on there every day of the week and twice on Sundays, as they
say.
Right.
O'Connor, no room on that right-hand side, and James Hume was waiting for him. He was waiting for him. Raka.
This is we're looking at the actions of the right player here, I think.
Yep. So and he does the same thing, right? He takes that L shape, yep, exactly as they put the diagram World Rugby did, and then again, drive, not dive. And I think again too, what's worth mentioning in both of these situations, or both, so looking back to the ones that we looked at that were negative and positive, those negative ones, the clean out came from an illegal place and then either created ball availability quicker than it should have come, or put a player in danger in a lot of the cases. In these situations, the defense, and this is kind of similar to what we were talking about with the maul thing, the defense actually gets some reward for putting the attack in the position to, oh, now I've got to square up and hit this legally. Because if that player has to take the time to do that, then the defense is able to either contest for the ball, set their shape, and it is able to be a more continuous and naturally flowing game of rugby rather than just downhill, who cares, side entries are fine, and as long as we're running with the ball, it's all good. Like, no, there's like the two facets of the game that we're responsible for: contest continuity and then safety as well, of course.
Let's look at one more.
Raka.
Yeah, and so I think this one is an example of entering square and then driving slightly at an angle. No, not really. Well, he ends up sort of like in that.
Yeah, there is an effort to square here from this player, which is different from the effort from what we saw. So this player, there's a turn, and then they're driving from that position. So I think World Rugby have suggested that is something that we don't want to go looking for, find a penalty where one really doesn't exist.
Absolutely.
Okay. That's it with the clips. Tig, are there any more questions we need to answer before we finish up the session? Oh, I think you're on mute.
Finished off a couple with quick written answers, including that this will be posted on the same resources webpage as the others. Thank all of you for taking an hour and joining us. And lastly, if after you've discussed this amongst your own society or club, you still can't make sense of what World Rugby has put out, you can send an email question to us at laws@usa.rugby.
Awesome. Thanks to everyone. Enjoy your season. Have a great time, and we'll catch you next time around.
Bye.